When the mountain landslide happened, I fell down with Camille. My boyfriend picked up Camille in front of me and left, leaving me alone there. Everyone hurriedly took Camille to the hospital. Nobody cared about me. When I was rescued to the hospital, my boyfriend never came to see me. But when I no longer loved him, he cried and said he loved me. Chapter 1. When the mountain landslide happened, I, who was standing steadily, was pulled by Camille and brought down by her. Felix anxiously picked up Camille and left, without even looking at me. Actually, compared to Camille, I was the one who got hurt the most. She and I were stopped by a tree, but I was unlucky. I hit the tree first. My foot was pierced by branches. Because I cushioned her, she just got a few scratches. As soon as Felix came down, my tears couldn't stop, and before I could speak, he picked up Camille and left. He never looked at me from start to finish. It was only when Lisa and a group of scenic area staff rescued me that I finally couldn't hold on and fainted. I lay in the hospital for a month, during which Lisa would cry every time she saw me. Sorry, Gil, it's all my fault. I thought Felix would save you, so I stupidly followed them and left. When I went to get help, I only saw Felix putting a girl into the ambulance. I thought it was you, so I didn't think much about it. I'm really sorry, Gil. If I had paid more attention, it would have been better. I comfortingly patted Lisa's head. It really wasn't Lisa's fault. After all, I also thought Felix would definitely save me, and even after he carried Camille away, I still hoped he would find someone else to save me. Although my foot was pierced by branches, luckily it didn't hit the bone, so with some rest, it would heal. The day I was discharged, Felix came to pick me up. He looked very haggard. Even when he picked me up carefully and put me in the car, it was as if I were some precious treasure. But when I arrived at his house and saw Camille, my fingers curled slightly. I liked being close to Felix, so even though I moved out, I bought a house opposite Felix's and became his neighbor. Many people came to Felix's house. They were all his friends. Gil, everyone is here to celebrate your discharge. Before he could finish speaking, a sweet voice rang out. Felix, where are the spices in your house? I'll find them, you won't be able to. Felix quickly got up and walked towards the kitchen. How do you know I won't find them? Camille's slightly displeased voice came through. Felix's tone wasn't very good, but there was an intimacy that others couldn't interrupt. Why don't you find it yourself? I don't believe you can find it. Look all you want, I don't believe I can't find it. Hey, why do you two always argue when you're together? Is there anything we can help with? Let us lend a hand. Felix's friends all went into the kitchen, cheerful laughter coming from there. I looked at the few people left playing games on the side. Even though there were many people in the house, I didn't have anyone to talk to. I felt a warmth at my feet. A very beautiful white ragdoll cat was nuzzling my feet affectionately. Lisa gave me this ragdoll cat, but it had always been Felix taking care of it. A little princess who can't even take care of herself wants to raise a cat. When I excitedly said I wanted to take care of it myself, Felix patted my head with a smile. As long as Felix is here, I won't raise it. Felix will definitely take care of it. You. Chapter 2. I held it quietly and absent-mindedly until Camille came out and, seeing me holding the cat, quickly walked over to me. Gil, go wash your hands, it's time to eat. She naturally took the cat from me, and the kitten didn't resist her actions at all, instead snuggling in her arms like a spoiled child. This cat was not very affectionate. It took a long time to get close to someone. I watched Camille skillfully feed the kitten, and my numb heart suddenly ached dully. I have no appetite, I'm not eating. After saying that, I left Felix's house. When I returned to my own house, I soon heard Felix ringing the doorbell. Gil, what are you sulking about again? We were busy in the kitchen for so long just to celebrate your discharge. Why did you leave without a word? Aren't you being too much? Can't you be a bit more mature? I had been ignoring Felix the whole time, until his voice didn't come through. I realized my face was already wet. The next day, after Felix went to work, I went to his house and took the kitten away. My friend is a cat lover, so giving the kitten to her was a good choice. After sending the kitten away, I packed up and went back to my parents' house. The Wilson mansion was very luxurious, exuding exquisite elegance everywhere. Next door was the Carter family, and Felix and I had been childhood sweethearts. Everyone who knew me and Felix knew that I was someone he doted on endlessly. From a young age, the person I liked to stick to the most was Felix. I heard my mom say that when I was a child, during the grabbing the object game, I didn't want anything else. I had a clear goal, to crawl to Felix and hug him without letting go. However, the 3 years older Felix sat on the ground holding me, not daring to move. They said it was the first time they saw Felix, who usually had a blank expression on his face all day, looking like he was facing a formidable enemy. Even now, some people still bring up this incident. The first words I spoke weren't mom or dad, but big brother. Because of this, my parents were quite jealous. Whenever I returned here, I always thought of Felix. My parents found it strange that I suddenly came home, but they were more happy than anything. After dinner, I went to the study to find my dad. "Tell me, you've been upset since you got home. Did something happen outside?" I wordlessly placed a photo of Felix and Camille in front of my dad. Initially smiling at me, my dad's expression turned sour upon seeing the two people in the picture who seemed to have a special bond. My dad knew what kind of person Felix was. Felix had a special relationship with Camille. This kind of special bond used to be exclusive to me. I could never tolerate someone coveting my things, whether it was toys or clothes. Anything that could be taken away was beneath me. I showed my dad this photo with a simple message: "I don't want Felix anymore." My dad stayed silent for a moment before speaking. "Gil, how do you want to handle this?" "I want to cancel our engagement with him." Felix and I got together after finishing the college entrance exam. On the first day we were together, he brought his family to my house and said he wanted to get engaged to me. My dad had been giving him disapproving looks ever since. "In a few days, when Uncle Carter and the others come back, we'll go talk to them about this." My dad stayed silent for a moment before slowly speaking. "All right." I lowered my head, calmly replying, but warm tears still fell on my hands. When my dad pried open my hand, I realized that my nails had deeply embedded into my flesh. My whole palm was a blur of blood and flesh. Chapter 3. In the evening, Felix called me, sounding very anxious. "Gil, Milo is missing. I haven't seen it since I came back from work. I gave it away to someone else." I responded to Felix's words, and the next moment, an angry girl's voice came into my ears. "Miss Wilson, you are too much. Why did you give Milo to someone else? Don't you think your behavior is irresponsible? Miss Wilson, you raised Milo for so long, don't you have any feelings at all? Why did you casually give it away to someone else?" I didn't know if it was uncomfortable for Camille to speak to me like this while holding Felix's phone, with Felix showing no reaction. Or was it uncomfortable for me that Camille was still with Felix at this point? I didn't listen any further, hung up the phone, and rushed to the bathroom to vomit. After recovering, I blacklisted all of Felix's contact information. Lisa knew I was in a bad mood, so she took me out of the house under the pretext of going shopping. I accompanied her lacklusterly, and the weather was nice today. Lisa loves beauty and enjoys buying all kinds of expensive jewelry. When we were looking at jewelry at the Juicien store, I couldn't help but marvel at the beautiful pieces. I've never lacked these things. I am an only child, and I have always been pampered by the Wilson family. In addition to my parents, Felix occasionally gives me these pieces of jewelry, often worth millions. I heard from my mom that Felix was keen on buying various gifts for me when he was young. Just the things Felix bought for me could fill several rooms. However, I still love looking at beautiful jewelry. After shopping, Lisa and I were happily planning to go back when suddenly someone stood in front of me. "Gil, why are you here?" I saw the person clearly, Camille's brother Bernie. I frowned and didn't want to talk to him. Seeing that I ignored him, Bernie actually tried to grab my wrist. Lisa, quick on the draw, grabbed his hand. "What do you think you're doing?" Lisa's face darkened. Bernie hesitated for a moment, pulled his hand away from Lisa's grip. Gil, are you such a disdainful rich young lady? I said hi to you, and you didn't even respond. I looked at Bernie, my eyes cold. What are you? I have to respond to you. The store clerks nearby couldn't help but laugh. This jewelry store belongs to my family, and Lisa and I occasionally come here, so the staff are familiar with me. Seeing my disdain for Bernie, the staff immediately came over and escorted him out of the store. Bernie, who was being driven away in front of everyone, was furious. Wanting to approach me, he was solidly blocked by the bodyguards. Gil, are you so insulting to people? No wonder Felix said you are hard to serve, full of princess syndrome. Who do you think you are? Lisa, hearing his words, subconsciously glanced at me. Seeing her concern, I comfortingly patted her hand. Bernie, if it weren't for Felix, do you think you have the qualifications to see me? Chapter 4. Bernie is Camille's brother, and because of Camille's relationship, I have met him a few times. Always looking down on me, thinking I'm delicate and hard to serve. Basically, if I wasn't born into a good family, he thinks I'm nothing. Even if I change designer bags every now and then, he thinks I'm wasting money. I really want to know what's going on in his head. Being born into the Wilson family, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I was pampered by my family. Don't say I change bags, even if I throw one away after using it, I have the capital to do so. What kind of mindset does he have to feel like he has the right to criticize my life? Where does he get the audacity to demand my attention? Throw him out. Ignoring his angry shouts, I straightforwardly told the bodyguard. Make sure he doesn't appear in front of me again. The bodyguard swiftly escorted Bernie out, while Bernie muttered something in annoyance. I had no interest in paying attention to him. It wasn't until I got home that a strange message appeared on my phone. It was a video, so I opened it. The scene in the video looked like it was in a bar, shot from a discreet angle, probably taken without permission. But it didn't matter, I could still clearly see Felix in the video. Felix, is it Miss Wilson calling you? Why aren't you answering? Camille sat beside Felix, the two of them very close. I don't want to bother, she's so immature every day. If only she had half of your maturity. Felix's voice was as cold and distant as always. His voice was pleasant to listen to. There was a time when I had insomnia. Felix would call me every day, no matter how busy he was. He would soothe me to sleep before continuing to deal with company matters. Even during the busiest times when he first took over the company. His voice, once sweet to me, now felt like a poisoned dagger. Cutting into my heart and lungs. I don't know how I ended up in the room, but I went crazy and smashed the things Felix gave me into pieces. It wasn't until my mother hugged me and cried that I realized I had several wounds on my body, still bleeding. I hugged my mother, but couldn't make a sound. When my parents were busy when I was little, I was always left with Felix. You could say Felix raised me. He knew all my likes and dislikes, what I like to eat, what I don't like to eat, he knows it all. I'm picky, but as long as Felix asks me to eat something I don't like, I'll force myself to eat it with a bitter face. Felix taught me how to write, Felix helped me with my homework. Felix has loved me for so many years, and the one who hurt me the most is also Felix. Uncle and Aunt Carter returned quickly, and my parents took me to the Carter's house. What I didn't expect was that Felix had also returned. Not only him, but he also came with Camille. Felix seemed surprised to see me and my parents at Carter's house. His expression was unusually flustered. Even his voice sounded more urgent. Gil, Uncle, and Aunt Wilson. Miss Wilson, please don't misunderstand. I'm just here to pick up some documents with Felix. Camille spoke up from the side, but no one paid attention to her. Chapter 5. Felix walked quickly to my side, wanting to hold my hand, but I dodged away. He immediately crouched beside me, looking at me carefully. I ignored him and continued to look at Uncle and Aunt Carter. Uncle Carter, as agreed earlier, let's cancel the engagement between Felix and me. What do you mean cancel? Gil, are you trying to cancel our engagement? Don't be childish, this is not something to joke about. Felix held my hand tightly, his grip was strong, making my hand ache. Fine. Uncle Carter sighed helplessly, and as soon as he spoke, Felix stood up in excitement. What do you mean fine? I don't agree. Gil, let's not play this joke, I can't take it. Felix, are you crazy? If the engagement is cancelled, it's cancelled. What are you making a fuss about? Uncle Carter, infuriated, smashed his wine glass at Felix with full force. He hit Felix's head so hard that it started bleeding. Felix instinctively covered the wound. Gil, don't look, it might scare you. I was afraid of blood, so Felix always paid extra attention to these things. I finally looked at him, but I didn't say a word to him. I stood up and left the Carter's house with my parents. Felix wanted to follow, but Uncle Carter stopped him. I couldn't hear what they were saying. Back at home, my mom said she would sleep with me tonight, which made my dad visibly upset. I teased my dad with a silly face, then hugged my mom's arm and closed my eyes. When my mom's breathing became steady, I opened my eyes. Since the incident on the hill, I had been suffering from insomnia night after night. Not long after, it started raining heavily outside, accompanied by thunder. The room has good soundproofing, and there wasn't much noise when the thunder was loud. I thought for a moment, then walked to the balcony, and unexpectedly saw Felix downstairs. I'm afraid of thunder. When I was little, I would cry and ask for Felix whenever there was thunder. When I was at his house or when he was staying at my house, I would take the doll he gave me and go find him. Felix would kindly tuck me into the blanket and then turn on a small light to tell me stories. He would only go to sleep after I fell asleep. As I grew older and it wasn't appropriate to sleep together, he would call me or sit by my bed and chat with me. Another round of thunder brought me back from my memories. Felix seemed to sense something and looked up. However, the glass was one way, so he couldn't see me at all. Afraid to look at him again, I slowly sat on the ground, hugging my knees, lost in thought, recalling many things from the past. Felix held such an important place in my life. For over 20 years, Felix's figure has always been in my memories. My parents were always very busy, and the time they spent with me wasn't even as much as Felix's. Whenever my parents were too busy, Felix would be the one to come for the parent-teacher meeting. Because Felix and I attended the same school, both in elementary and middle school. So, what I feared most in elementary school was meeting my teachers when walking home with Felix. As soon as I misbehaved, they would solemnly report me to Felix. Then Felix would sternly make me copy books. I would cry halfway through each time, and he would always give in to me. Copying books was my family's way of punishing me for misbehaving, although most of the time Felix secretly helped me copy. Chapter 6. Every time I was punished to copy books, Felix would bring a lot of food to my house. Then he would wipe away my tears, make me sit aside, eat, and watch him copy for me. Felix, your handwriting is too beautiful, make it uglier, or else Dad will notice. Got it, you need to practice more writing, you know. Oh. Every time my dad looked at the books I handed in for punishment, he always hesitated to speak because basically 2/3 of it was copied by Felix. The difference in their handwriting was like night and day, visible to anyone at a glance. Later, when he realized that no matter how much he punished me to copy, it was always Felix who ended up doing it, he started punishing me in a more meaningful way. I didn't become more obedient, but Felix's handwriting became more beautiful. After my dad realized this trick didn't work on me, he never punished me to copy books again. As a result, Felix learned this trick from him. The time we spent together as teenagers was the happiest days for both of us. In fact, I did notice some of the changes he went through later on. Camille is the one I sponsored to go to college, and she is indeed outstanding. We are not in the same profession, I heard her name from my roommate. She is truly exceptional, even though her family conditions are very poor, she still managed to get into this school. Her grades have always been the top in their field. My interaction with her was because I heard someone casually mention that her family didn't allow her to study. I sponsored her. I never really thought much of it until she came to thank me. I saw Felix pause for a moment when he saw her. At that time, Camille was like a strong pine tree, exuding an aura of perseverance. I think Felix probably had never seen a girl like her before because in our circle, we only interact with people from very well-off families. No one there ever worries about money issues. Camille is gentle yet strong, she doesn't need Felix to treat her with kid gloves. She is sensible, gentle, and generous, completely different from my difficult and spoiled nature. When I opened my eyes again, I saw my mother wrapping both of us in a blanket. My mom and I leaned on each other's heads and fell asleep. I smiled and gently moved my mom's hand, and she quickly opened her eyes. Getting old, it's uncomfortable to sleep like this. Get up, time for breakfast. My mom didn't say anything, I smiled and nudged her shoulder. Okay. When I went out after changing clothes, I saw Felix. His expression was grim, probably due to being out in the rain all night. His face was pallid, lacking any color. Gil, why didn't you answer my calls yesterday? Were you scared during the thunderstorm? Did you rest well last night? I calmly looked at Felix. Felix, I'm not a child. I used to be scared of thunder when I was young, it was just an excuse to hear Felix's voice more and have more conversations with him. There's no need for that now, why would I still say I'm afraid of thunder? Felix understands me the most, he knows what I mean. I really let him go. Felix's expression became even worse, he looked on the verge of collapse. His eyes were red, glaringly so. I instinctively turned my head and prepared to leave. Chapter 7. Gil, please, I beg you, I was wrong, I really was. Felix's hand was trembling as he held mine, warm drops of water falling on my hand. I was a bit surprised, this was the first time I had seen Felix cry. But I still pulled my hand back. Felix, you know my character best. I would rather break than bend, no one can make me suffer. Felix cried until his voice choked up, struggling to move his pale, bloodless lips, yet not a single word came out. Felix, let's leave it at that. Without paying any more attention to Felix, I left on my own. I heard Felix's name again after a month, when Aunt Carter called me. Gil, could you come and see Felix? He hasn't eaten or drunk anything for a long time. After some thought, I agreed to go see Felix because Aunt Carter has always been kind to me, and I didn't want to refuse her. When I arrived at the hospital, Aunt Carter hugged me. Just take a look at him, Aunt won't force you to do anything else. I know he did something wrong, I'm sorry, Gil, for making you suffer. I comforted Aunt Carter by patting her hand and soothing her softly for a while until she calmed down, then I went to Felix's hospital room. As soon as I entered, I saw Felix on the hospital bed. He had lost a lot of weight, his hands, once clearly defined with bones, now showed prominent veins. I sighed as I looked at the 4-tube in his hand. As if sensing my presence, the person who had his eyes closed opened them. The previously hollow eyes, devoid of any spirit, suddenly lit up. Gil. Felix sat up regardless of his condition, tightly grabbing my hand. His eyes stared at me without blinking, as if afraid I would disappear the next moment. Gil, am I dreaming? You came to see me. Gil, do I look terrible now? Were you scared? This is the longest you've ignored me. I miss you so much, it's driving me crazy. It seemed like it had been too long since he last spoke. Felix's voice sounded like an old machine, with a kind of unnatural stiffness. I looked at the red blood vessels in his eyes and the dark circles underneath, hesitated for a moment, then found a chair to sit down. Felix, is being with me exhausting for you? After observing him for a while, I spoke up. Felix paused upon hearing my words, stiffly tugging at the corners of his mouth, revealing a smile uglier than crying. No, Gil, I've never thought that way. Felix tightly held my hand and lowered his head. Felix has always been proud, besides me, he has never lowered his head to anyone or anything. You know, I can't deceive you, and you can't deceive me either. Since the day I was born, we have been entangled together, for over 20 years of being together, no one understands each other better than Felix and I. I know he never had feelings for Camille, he doesn't like her. But being around Camille makes him feel relaxed. Felix finds it exhausting to be with me, but he feels at ease when he's with Camille. This realization made me more devastated than when Felix chose to take Camille with him down the hill instead of me. Chapter 8. Gil, no, it's not true, really, believe me, I just love you too much. I'm so afraid that I'm not good enough, afraid that you won't like me if you see my flaws. Just the thought of this possibility is driving me crazy. Felix's emotions became increasingly unstable. He held me in his arms, his voice full of sorrow and despair. I just love you too much, Gil, I can't live without you. Please, forgive me, please. I sighed, pushed him away. Take care of yourself, Aunt and Uncle are very worried about you. Gil, I'll listen, I'll take care of myself, please don't ignore me. Without answering Felix, I left the hospital room. As soon as I stepped out, I saw Aunt Carter sitting on a chair. We found a place to sit together. She held my hand, lost in thought. I heard from your mother that you've been taking sleeping pills all the time, is it because of Felix? I nodded. Ever since I discovered Felix's special feelings for Camille, I couldn't sleep through the night. When he's awake these days, he drinks, and when he's drunk, he calls out your name. He's been going crazy these days, on the verge of breakdown every day. He didn't cry much when he was little, I hardly saw him cry a few times. After you came along, he started treating himself like a big brother all the time. Saying he wanted to set a good example for you, he never cried again. But these days, I often hear very light sobbing outside his room. Were you feeling the same way back then? Listening to Aunt Carter's gentle words, I remembered the time when I first found out that something was wrong between Felix and Camille. At that time, I really felt like the sky was falling. I couldn't imagine why Felix would have feelings for someone else. Perhaps he felt bored of being with me for so long, that's why he became interested in someone with a completely different personality. Even if he loved me, he still abandoned me many times, just to chase after that so-called excitement. But after losing me completely, he showed deep remorse, which was quite ridiculous. If I didn't love him so much, maybe I wouldn't care about this. Because I have seen couples who got together through marriage, treating each other with respect after marriage, without interfering with each other. Since then, I never went to see Felix again. Instead, I threw myself into busy work. Most of the time, I was so busy that I hardly had time to sleep, but my days were fulfilling. It wasn't until Camille appeared in front of me again that I felt a sense of confusion. I haven't thought about her and Felix for a long time. Camille's face looked terrible, with dark circles under her eyes. She stopped me on my way home from work, and even though I didn't want to get involved with her, she stood in front of me and refused to leave. I reluctantly agreed to talk to her. Chapter 9. You have everything, why won't you let go of Felix and give him to me? Camille stared at me intensely, her voice sharp from being too excited. Are you deliberately having my roommate mention you in front of me, and then asking me for help? Is it because you want to get to know Felix through me? Ever since I noticed Camille getting close to Felix, I had suspicions. Why would my roommate bring up Camille in front of me out of nowhere and always inadvertently mention Camille's family situation? My mother has always been involved in charity work, sponsoring poor students for education, so I also joined in to sponsor students. So when I sponsored Camille, I didn't think much of it, considering Camille's family was not well off. But it wasn't until a former college roommate asked me about when Felix and I were getting married, and I told them about our breakup, that the friend who had mentioned Camille's poor background to me privately messaged me. She asked if I broke up with Felix because of Camille. I was surprised why she would think of Camille, especially since I didn't mention the reason for the breakup. Actually, back then it was Camille who asked me to talk to you about sponsoring her education. We were high school classmates, so I mentioned it to you when she asked. Later, I found out that even though her family seemed poor, she still had money for education. Even though Camille came from a single-parent household, her mother had to support both Camille and her younger brother alone, while her father still had some money. Her father would send living expenses to Camille's mother every month, but it all ended up being gambled away by her mother, making it seem like they couldn't afford education. But Camille's father had long set aside money for Camille and her brother's education, which he directly gave to them without involving Camille's mother. I found out about this when I returned to my hometown after graduating from college and overheard people gossiping. When I was a freshman, I saw a photo of Felix in Camille's phone, but I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I looked at the messages she sent me for a long time, and in the end, besides finding it amusing, I felt a hint of bitterness in my heart. Camille suddenly laughed, looking a bit manic. Yes, I deliberately used your name to get close to Felix. In his eyes, there's only you. I've liked him for so many years, but he won't even look at me. I'm so jealous, insanely jealous. Why does he always pay attention only to you? Even my name is only remembered by him because of you. Listening to Camille's words, I was stunned. You've liked Felix for a long time, you knew him before? I met Felix when I went to the provincial competition in high school, and I fell in love with him from that time. It would have been so much better without you. Before I could react, someone suddenly covered my mouth and nose from behind. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself tied to a pillar by the sea. The tide had started to rise, and the water was up to my waist. Camille, this lunatic. Chapter 10. I struggled desperately, but Camille's knots were too tight, and I couldn't free myself. As the seawater began to cover my mouth and nose, in a daze, I seemed to see Felix. When I woke up in the hospital, both my mom and dad were there, looking at them looking haggard, with the extra white hair. I regretted the decision to use myself as bait back then to see what Camille was up to. If only I had ignored Camille back then, my parents wouldn't have been so worried. Lisa's eyes were red from crying, telling me that Camille and her brother had already gone to prison. When Camille came to find me back then, I called Lisa, and thanks to Lisa's cleverness, she recorded our conversation. And with my parents determined to make Camille pay, Camille and Bernie couldn't escape prison. Camille has serious mental problems. Whatever Camille wants, she must have. In high school, there was a classmate whose grades were on par with hers, both likely to qualify for university scholarships. However, that student was led by Camille in cold violence, causing them to drop out of high school. I listened quietly, and after a long time, I spoke up. What about Felix? Lisa fell silent immediately. I didn't rush her, just quietly watching her. After a while, she lowered her head, avoiding my gaze. It was Felix who found you. By the time we arrived, he had already rescued you. His condition is not very good. Carter's aunt, who had been watching over Felix, left the ward after asking me a few concerned questions, leaving me alone with Felix. Felix on the hospital bed had his eyes tightly closed, looking frail. According to Lisa, the chances of Felix waking up were slim. I sat by Felix's bedside, holding his hand. Since the doctor said I could be discharged, I came to see Felix every day. Most of the time, I just sat there staring at him. And many times, I would tell Felix about everything that happened to me that day. Unknowingly, 3 months had passed. Felix, please wake up. I lay on the edge of Felix's hospital bed, dejectedly burying my face in the blanket. The next moment, I felt a gentle touch on my head. When I incredulously looked at Felix, he was gently looking back at me. When Felix was discharged, I didn't go to pick him up. I started reducing my visits to the hospital from the time he woke up. So much so that every time I went, Felix would quietly complain to me, saying I didn't care about him. When I tried to respond, he would change the subject, subconsciously avoiding the topic. I knew he was worried I would get angry and never visit him again. Once, while I was resting my eyes, Felix thought I was asleep and carefully slipped a ring onto my ring finger. He kissed my ring finger with unusual reverence. Gil, I love you. Felix's lips were slightly cold, and when they touched my hand, my breath caught for a moment. Luckily, Felix didn't notice. Soon after, he discreetly took the ring back and acted as if nothing had happened when I woke up. By the time Felix was discharged, I was already preparing to go abroad for work. When I reached the airport, Felix called me. I assumed Aunt Carter must have told him about my plans to leave the country. I'm sorry. The phone call remained silent for a long time without Felix speaking. I patiently waited until the announcement reminded me to board, and only then did Felix speak softly, saying sorry. I calmly smiled. Goodbye, Felix. I couldn't forget everything that had happened before. Since the moment a third person easily intervened in our relationship, I had already killed the Gil who once deeply loved Felix. From now on, the road ahead is long and steep, and there will never be Felix again.